last presentation I gave, which was a week ago, to about the same number of people. It went 2 hours, and it was only on one of the 4 sections we're talking about today. So,
so you can bring in lunch.
So I'll try and pick up the pace. So everybody has an outline. Does anybody not have an outline? Okay, so we'll jump right in. So I'm going to give a little bit of historical perspective that's even before we get into the outline. Economic development, as we think of it today here in New Mexico, really started in 1960. And that was when Albuquerque Industrial Development was created. And that was created by a group of business people, pretty much led by Gene Hinkle, if you know him. And so it was started because a company had left Albuquerque at that time that was a manufacturer that was, at the time, a fair number of jobs that came to an end. And so they recognized the dependency that we had then on the labs and the base, which we still have. But they felt that there was a real need to bring in new industry. And so that was the creation of Albuquerque Industrial Development, which is a nonprofit and been very successful in focusing on recruiting to Albuquerque, new companies. The next major event in New Mexico from an economic development standpoint was the closure of Walker Air Force Base in Roswell. That was like in the mid-60s, I want to say. And so Governor Campbell, at the time, sent who many people refer to as the father of New Mexico economic development, Bob Hoffman. And he sent Bob Hoffman down to Roswell to try to figure out how can we redeploy these assets that were previously an Air Force base. And there was real concern that Roswell would basically cease to exist because over half of the jobs in that town were either on the base or base related. And so Bob was very successful at doing that, but there really wasn't at the state level any economic development entity prior to the governor having Bob go do that. So Bob was able to bring in some of the airlines. Back then the big airlines were Pan Am and TWA, and he brought them in to actually have repair depots in Roswell. He brought in a fireworks manufacturer to operate out of one of the hangars. That's still ongoing all these years later. So then the next economic development event was really Governor Cargo, who was really big on tourism. And so he created, I don't know if it's called the Department of Tourism, but he was governor from 66 to 70. That was when the governor terms were 2 years. And he had two two-year terms. So in that period of time, the thrust at the state level was trying to get tourism, because that was considered to be, jobs created from tourism were not detrimental to the environment. They were new money coming into the state, and that was the main thrust. So then in the early 70s was when the state actually stood up its Department of Economic Development. And the first incentive was started at that time, which we're going to get into a little bit later, which was at that time called in-plant training. But that's just kind of some historical background of events that took place here in New Mexico at that time. So the common denominator, whether you're looking at cities or counties or states or federal governments that have economic development departments, it's all about jobs. And jobs are really the measuring stick that economic developers measure their performance, and are they really making a difference? And so back at that time, the prevailing thinking was that not all jobs are the same. They're not all equally good, or some are better than others. And so the two primary differentiators as to what makes one job that you create better than another job is the duration or longevity of the job and the pay of the job. So the perception was at that time that the best jobs on both of those metrics were manufacturing. They believed that manufacturing jobs had much more longevity in terms of how long will that job exist than what at the time were service jobs or construction jobs and such. And the feeling at that time was that they were higher paying as well. And so many of the economic incentives that we'll be talking about today, you'll need to just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, as that was the prevailing thinking when a lot of these were created in terms of really being focused on the manufacturing sector. So economic-based jobs, you may hear that term from time to time, and an economic-based job is a job where the employer that is employing that person is considered an economic-based business. And an economic-based business is one that over half of their revenues come from out-of-state customers. Okay? So when we talk about some of these incentives, you'll also see not only do they favor manufacturing, they also very much favor economic-based businesses. And so regardless of whether a business is making a product or selling a service, if it's an economic-based business, it will be eligible for a number of the state incentive programs. Okay? So the idea is that if you want to grow a local economy, you need to do it by the creation of economic-based businesses and economic-based jobs, which bring new money into the economy to make the pie bigger. Rather than if you think about retail businesses, which would typically have all of their customers be local, that's not bringing new money into the economy. It's just making the money that's already there spin a little bit faster. And that doesn't grow the economy. So that's kind of the flavor of what is behind a lot of the thinking. So let's talk about what the different entities are that are involved in economic development and what their roles are and so forth. So I'll start with the state. So the state has its Department of Economic Development, and the state doesn't recruit. That's not their purpose. The recruiting arm for the state of New Mexico is called the New Mexico Partnership. And the Department of Economic Development, which has been around back to the 70s, in comparison to the partnership, which has only been around probably a dozen years. So previously to the partnership's existence, the department did some recruiting, but not all that much. The partnership does nothing but recruiting for the state of New Mexico. Then city and county governments will have departments of economic development, and typically they don't really do any recruiting either of new businesses, but they do assist with trying to they don't take the lead in the recruiting effort, but they do assist in working with the clients that come and visit and look at their cities or their counties to potentially put a site there. The city of Albuquerque's Department of Economic Development, what I just said would certainly apply to. So a lot of times when AED, which is the recruiting arm for the city of Albuquerque, when they get an initial contact, what that might look like is either a site selection consultant might contact AED, or the actual principals of a company might contact AED and say, we're considering putting a site in the Albuquerque metro area. And so they'll make that contact, or AED may go out to trade shows and try to introduce themselves to different industries that would have trade shows that they think that Albuquerque would be very competitive in attracting. But that initial contact, in the case of the metro area, would be with AED. Then AED would then partner up with the New Mexico Partnership, with the City of Albuquerque's Department of Economic Development. If the client comes to town and wants to look at different sites around town that they might want to consider either moving into an existing building or raw land that they might want to construct a new building, then when they're here, AED would be at the lead point of contact and trying to put them in touch with realtors and anyone else that they might need to interface with to try to evaluate whether this is going to work for them or not. Bernalillo County Economic Development Department, they have a staff there as well. One thing I'm going to talk about a little later is industrial revenue bonds, which can be done with local city or county governments. And right now, Bernalillo County is doing probably 10 IRBs to every one that the city of Albuquerque is doing. And I can talk about that a little bit as well. So, let's talk about incentives. So there's incentives at different levels. There's the local government incentives, the state incentives, and then there's federal incentives. But 90% of the incentives are state incentives, okay? So I'm going to talk about each of these, and if you want to get in more detail about any particular one, feel free to ask any questions and so forth as we go. So JTIP, which is the Job Training Incentive Program that exists today, that I said was created in the early 70s, was originally called Implant Training. That's kind of the cornerstone. That really is the cornerstone of incentive plans. And what that program does is it reimburses companies a percentage of the wages for newly hired employees, okay? Now, a business to be JTIP eligible has to be either a manufacturing company or an economic-based business. And the typical reimbursement, it varies between whether the business is located in an urban part of the state or a rural part of the state. So there's basically 5 urban areas. There's Santa Fe, Rio Rancho, Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Roswell. Okay, if you're not in one of those 5 towns, then you're rural. And so the reimbursement rate is the lowest in the urban areas, and it's the highest in the rural areas. Okay, and the reimbursement rate in urban is 50% of the wages, up to a maximum of 1,040 hours. Now, the number of hours of reimbursement is based on the pay rate of the job. The higher the pay rate, the more hours of reimbursement. The minimum hours of reimbursement, I think, for like a $10 an hour job is like 320 hours. But then as the pay rate goes up, you get up to like 1,040 hours in the 20-some dollar an hour range. The 50% reimbursement can be increased if the job meets the definition of a high-wage job, which right today in urban is $40,000 a year and in rural is $28,000 a year. So if the newly created job is above that high-wage job definition, then you get an extra 5%, so 50 becomes 55% reimbursement. If you work through the Workforce Connection and use their Job Keys program, you get another extra 5%, so you can get up to 60% reimbursement by doing those 2 adders. The way JTIP functions is they have a board meeting every second Friday of the month. And your application goes in for the number of jobs that you're planning to hire, which is a 6-month hiring window time frame. And your application goes in 1 month before the board meeting, that they're going to hear your application. And then upon approval at that board meeting, your contract goes into effect that day. It's a 1-year contract with that day starting your 6-month hiring window. And there's no limit on how many jobs that you're going to add. There's no limit on how much you pay them. I've seen jobs, I've been going to pretty much every JTIP board meeting for the last 9 years. And I can tell you that the number of dollars per job has a huge range. The really low-paying jobs you might expect to see a couple of $1,000s reimbursement per job. Higher paying jobs I've seen as much as $25,000 per job. And I've seen everything in between. So JTIP is funded every year by the legislature. So every year, and JTIP is a subset of the State Department of Economic Development. So every year they're in front of the legislature trying to get funding. There have been times where the funding has run out, and that's a problem. It's a real problem in a couple of ways. About, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, they were running low on funding, and they had to reduce the reimbursement percentages. And so here you're out advertising to all the existing companies in the state and the ones you're recruiting, here's the program, here's how it works, here's the reimbursement rates. And then when there's a funding shortage, and that changes, now suddenly these companies that are relying on what they're being told and have multi-year hiring ramps that may go out 3-5 years, suddenly now the game has been changed on them, and that's really a problem. They can't count on it. So, so that's an issue. Right now, the JTIP fund has about $1.5 million, which, based on the monthly burn rate of this calendar year, will get us through till January 1st. So right now, the plan is to try to have the JTIP funding in this next session, which will be a 60-day long-term session, have it fast-tracked to where hopefully they can get it through both houses, get it to the governor, get it signed, and actually get it funded before the legislature's even over. That's what they're hoping. We'll see if that happens. But we really don't want to run out of money. Yes, ma'am?
Do we know, since this is politically a hot year, do we know if Governor Martinez historically supported this and signed off on it?
The governor is very supportive of JTIP, yeah. And for the most part, I would say the legislature is also, but I will say the governor is more supportive than the legislature. What happens in the legislature is a lot of this urban-rural fighting, and it's not about Republicans and Democrats. It's about urban and rural, to be quite honest. And so it's not necessarily a hard, fast rule, but because the state of New Mexico politically is really, the rural elected officials have more clout than the urban ones do, to be real frank. If a large portion of that JTIP money isn't going to rural, then the legislature doesn't like that. And you know, none of us have control over that.
But if we don't have anybody to give it to.
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
but nevertheless,
I
that's the reality of what you're dealing with. So there tends to be that kind of struggle in the legislature. Yeah.
Dennis, is there training? It used to be called in-plant training, and I know they're new jobs. Is there? But the money there doesn't necessarily have to be a training program. I know the Workforce Training Center did a lot of that.
It's a very good point. A lot of people think, well, gee, I'm going to hire a new person. I'm going to get 1,040 hours of reimbursement, but I don't have maybe 1,040 hours of a training program that I'm going to put this person through. No, that's not it. On-the-job training is training. Okay, so anybody that you hire to do anything is going to have some on-the-job training, right? So do you present in your application a training curriculum that you're going to put the person through? Yeah, you do. That is part of the application, but a huge piece of that can just be on-the-job training, and that's fine. Good question. So, any more questions about JTIP?
Does this also work with 1099, or is it strictly?
No.
Okay.
W-2.
W-2.
Yep. And there's no retroactive ability to go back prior to that board meeting that you approved on anyone you hired prior to that day. It's positions hired from the day of the board meeting out 6 months. Okay. All right. Manufacturing investment tax credit. That's been around over 20 years. And that is a tax credit. Now, JTIP, you get a check from Santa Fe. Okay. Most of the rest of these we're going to talk about are tax credits. And a lot of times we'll go, well, we're not profitable. We don't pay income tax. So tax credit doesn't do us any good. These aren't income tax credits. Okay? These are tax credits against any tax that you would pay on your CRS-1. Okay? And for those of you that don't know what the heck a CRS-1 is, there's 3 taxes that a business pays typically every month to Santa Fe on a CRS-1. There's gross receipts taxes, there's compensating taxes, and there's payroll withholding taxes. So there are a lot of companies, let's say economic-based businesses, where all their sales are to out-of-state customers. They don't have any gross receipts tax. And if they don't buy any supplies or whatever else from out-of-state vendors, that would be where they would have to pay compensating tax, they may not have any compensating tax either. But if they have employees in New Mexico, then they have payroll withholding tax that they can take the credits against. Okay? So you can take it against any of those 3 that you pay on the CRS-1. So the manufacturing investment tax credit is for manufacturing companies and the purchase of their manufacturing equipment. Okay? And I think the credit is, what is it, 5 1/8? Or I think that's it. And what you do is you bundle up all the manufacturing equipment that you buy in a calendar year, and then you have 1 year from the end of the year that you bought the equipment to file for the credit. Okay? Technology jobs tax credit, which really has to do with research and development expenditures. Okay? It's called the technology jobs tax credit, but it is all about what you're spending on research and development. So that tax credit is where if a business is incurring expenditures trying to develop a product or a service that they intend to sell, and so they're spending their money doing that research and development. It's not like they have a contract with a customer where they're doing R&D work on a customer contract. That doesn't qualify. But if they're spending their money to develop their products and services, same thing. You bundle up all of your expenditures in a calendar year, and then you have 1 year from the end of that year that you spent the money to file for the credit. Now, I go into businesses all the time and they say, well, we're not taking the federal R&D credit. Doesn't matter. You do take the federal R&D credit, or you don't take the federal R&D credit, you can still take the state credit. One has really nothing to do with the other. Okay, and why might a company not do the R&D credit? Well, you know, maybe they're not paying any income tax. They don't think it's worth the trouble. I don't know, but nevertheless, the state credit is a much broader definition of eligible R&D expenditures than the federal credit. Okay, federal credit is really just direct costs. Okay, like materials and labor kind of thing, where the state credit includes that as well, but it also allows you to be able to allocate indirect expenses that would be arguably applied to the R&D effort. So for example, say I've got a manufacturing facility, but 15% of my building is where I do my R&D work. I can allocate 15% of my rent and my utilities and whatever else to be eligible expenses, which I couldn't get that on the federal credit. Okay, so it's a much broader definition of eligible expenses. The credit's 4% of what you spend, and then there's a provision where you can get an additional 4% if you meet a certain test, and I'm not going to go there, but just so that you know that it could be more. And then it's also twice as much a percentage in the rural areas. So 4% is the urban percent. It's 8% in the rural areas, which could then be 16% in the rural areas if you get the second, pass the second test. Yeah,
Dennis,
Bob?
could you go back to the definition of manufacturer, because I know there's different definitions that float around at the state. Who'd be
The definition for JTIP purposes?
Who'd be included for the manufacturing credit? Does that include like food processors? Does that include?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Could it be assembly?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, there's three terms that I use from my background in private industry as a CFO. There's manufacturing, assembly, and system integrators. Okay? To me, those mean three really different things. To the state of New Mexico, they're all the same. They don't understand those subtleties quite the way I think of them, okay? So yeah, it's a very broad definition of manufacturing. Yes?
What about a virtual product, like software as a service or technology that's out in the cloud? It's not a box, but they are making something?
Yeah, software is kind of in a gray area, okay? Are you really manufacturing something if you're producing software?
Longevity.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people are struggling with that, putting IBM, and they're having a duck up with the SEC about how they report their revenue based on software.
Well, and here's the reality of that. Software engineers that are programmers, that are developing software, are usually pretty well-paid jobs, okay? And so back to the original premise of what I said, you want longevity and you want high-paying jobs, that's what we're really after. So the government really wants those kind of jobs, okay? And so that's where when you're trying to argue your case, that's how you argue it. So if you're trying to argue it to JTIP or tax and rev auditors or whoever you're trying to argue your case with, although tax and rev auditors don't really care about jobs, but nevertheless.
No surprise.
Okay.
Hey, Dennis?
Yes.
Before you leave the technology jobs tax credit, I was instrumental in actually writing that legislation.
Mhm.
And it is very, very broad. Your point, it can't be underscored enough. It is very broad on what you can include in the other costs that is significantly different than the federal research and development tax credit. So anybody who has clients that are thinking about it, I mean, just give me a call. I can help you understand it and explain it, or obviously Dennis can.
Yeah, I've got a client that might.
It's beneficial, and it is doubled in the rural areas because, as Dennis mentioned, you have the Senate, which is geographic, right? So, and then the House, which is based on population areas. So you got to get them through both legislative bodies, and that's where you end up with this issue of the rural versus the population centers. And so it's really beneficial in the rural areas, but literally, I mean, if you have somebody that is a cheese manufacturer and they're figuring out how they're going to increase production and they're doing research and development around that, that qualifies. And most of that's in rural areas, and they can get up to 16% credit, even though they may not be paying taxes, because you can basically get the withholdings that you have from your employees that are going up to the state of New Mexico for their taxes. That's part of what you can, they'll get credit for it, though it was withheld, but you get to keep the money. I mean, that's why it flows to it. It's really a good, these credits are really beneficial at the state level.
It's a good point to bring up that when you think traditionally of what is research and development, you know, what I think of is these engineer, scientist types sitting over here in a little laboratory doing their thing, right? But if you're a manufacturing company and you're doing process improvement to make your production more efficient and so forth, that qualifies. So that's not what a lot of people that are like me would typically think of as pure research and development.
So if you're experimenting, if you own a brewery and you're experimenting with different kinds of
Exactly.
beers,
Exactly.
could
That's-
be made to qualify.
That's right.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. I was involved, I rarely ever do recruiting. Okay, I work with local existing companies, help them grow and expand here in Albuquerque. But recently, I got assigned to work on a project. This business had a small manufacturing operation here in Albuquerque, about 25 employees, food manufacturer. And the parent company was looking to close the facility and relocate it to another state. And so I was assigned to try to save these jobs. And so I met with the 3 decision makers one early morning down on Central and went through in about 45 minutes a lot of information. You know, I said, here we go, guys, listen fast, because here we go. And they made the decision to actually close their LA facility and move it to Albuquerque. So we went from losing 25 jobs to a net gain of now 125 jobs. But as I got to know them and as I worked with them, they have all these recipes. I mean, they're a food manufacturer that manufactures brands that you would go into the grocery store and you'd see different brands, and they're the ones that are manufacturing what you see. And so they're constantly experimenting with new recipes to try to come out with new products. They put a lot of money into research and development, and so I never really thought that much about the food manufacturing business and how much R&D that they might do. This particular company, it's called Flagship, and it was announced in the papers not too long ago that they're coming here. The building, you know, the governor had a press conference at their new building and everything.
Which is where?
It's in Renaissance. It's, you know where Albuquerque Tortilla was? Well, about 5 years ago, Albuquerque Tortilla built a new expansion that they never moved into.
Right.
And it's that new expansion that they never moved into that this company's taken over.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, could the difference between the doubling for rural versus urban be achieved by simply locating in the far southwest valley?
Good question.
That was my question.
That's a really good question. So,
Great minds.
So there's different guidelines depending on which incentive you're talking about in terms of where are the boundaries of rural and urban. So for example, for JTIP, if you're within 10 miles of an urban area, you're urban.
Well, that works in New York.
11 and a half.
Okay, so if I'm in Bernalillo, New Mexico, for JTIP purposes, I'm urban, because my boundary is right up against Rio Rancho, okay? But for some of these other incentives, if I'm in Bernalillo, I'm rural. So
And it varies by what distinguishes it, county lines, arbitrary lines.
Yeah.
What's in the legislation?
Okay.
Legislation of the regs that
Yeah.
were written to support us.
The one question I have is, when I bumped into people who are trying to take these credits, they always go, well, I need a battery of accountants, and this has a different rule than that, and all of these other things to try to deal with it. Have they done anything on that, so you can tell a business, no, this really isn't going to cost you a lot of additional work to track this, and then have to prevail in front of a tax auditor?
I'll say this. When I was a CFO, I used to do a lot of these, right? I did it. I didn't delegate it to anyone on my staff, I did it. So I was very familiar with doing them, but I haven't had a full-time CFO job for 10 years, okay? I have clients that I'm their part-time CFO, that I do them for, but I've just really been doing a lot of these for clients just the last year. And it's not like it used to be. Tax and Rev, they want to make it hard. Okay? It's not an accident. They want to make it really difficult. And so the compliance, just taking the technology jobs tax credit, you really do need to have a very clean, robust audit trail of these expenditures and documentation, and yeah, you do. So is it something that that a good accountant is gonna struggle to do? No, it's not.
But it's not true.
But you do want a good accountant. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I help our clients for free if they want to do that. And I won't fill out the forms for them, but I'll give them the guidance as to how to do it, and then review it, and there's no cost to the client of ours. But yeah, I explained exactly what you're explaining. And tax rev over the last 4 years has made it, in my opinion, more difficult. In fact, there maybe need to do a little cleanup or stuff in the legislative activities upcoming year or something.
Well, and speaking of cleanup, great lead-in.
Yeah, I know.
So the next one is the high wage job tax credit. The high wage job tax credit was created early in the Richardson administration in 2004. And it is a tax credit that is for the creation of a job that's above that 40,000 threshold in urban and 28,000 in rural. The credit is 10% of the wages of the job and the ERISA benefits, which are typically insurance and retirement. And you get the 10% on those things for 4 years. Now this one does have a cap. The maximum credit per employee per year is $12,000. So 10% of 120,000 is 12,000. So I guess the thinking at the time that they imposed the limit of 12,000 per year per employee was kind of thinking like 100,000 a year job with maybe 20,000 benefits, something like that. But there's no limit on how many jobs, just the limit on how much credit per year per employee.
And what is the bottom end of high wage?
40,000 in urban and 28,000 in rural, which is going to change the middle of next year, July 1 of 2015, and the 40 in urban is going to go to 60, and the 28 in rural is going to go to 40. Okay?
How many jobs in New Mexico are currently given credits like this?
To me, those, dollar thresholds, to me, I don't think of a $40,000 job as being all that high wage. But what do I know? So in a sense, I don't have that much heartburn over them bringing them up to higher levels, but there's a lot of companies that could be taking these that aren't. A lot of them. Yeah. Now, this particular one became very, I'll say, problematic for several reasons. The legislators, when they created, didn't really think it through well enough, I guess you could say. And so this did have some cleanup language that was done here a couple years ago to try to fix some of that. They didn't put anything into the original bill that limited how far back in time retroactively you could go. That became a problem. It became a problem because companies that never knew about it going back in 04, but learned about it, say, in 010, and now they had like 6 years of people that they had hired, and they had hired a bunch, now submit their first application, and it's for millions of dollars. And it came at a time when the state budget was in a budget crisis. So the confluence of those events at the same time really was bad. So Tax and Rev really threw up the red flags that we've got this horrible crisis and it's disaster. So they did, in the cleanup language, limit how far back you can go, which was really, they should have done from the very beginning. The other thing was Tax and Rev was coming up with their own definitions of what wages qualified for the 40 test or the 28 test. And, that wasn't the best because then this tax and rev person using this definition and this tax and rev person using this definition. That was problematic. So the definition is now determined in the cleanup language. So all of that was needed, and it's good, but there's still some kind of hard feelings over this particular credit in state government. I mean, not just tax and rev. I mean the legislature too, who they don't like to take credit for their mistakes, but they got some egg on their face as well. So anyway, it's a great credit. It can be a lot of money. And for jobs, talk about software development companies that, their typical job pays $80,000 a year. You can only imagine if they're hiring 50 of those kinds of jobs, what their tax credit might be. The other thing is...
11.5 miles outside the city, right?
No, that's not the highway, that's the JTIP.
I know.
Yeah,
I'm checking all the angles.
Are these 3 tax credits mutually exclusive?
No, great question. So you can double dip, you can triple dip, okay? I can go hire a new person, get a JTIP application on them, get reimbursement from that. I can pay them over $40,000 a year, get high wage on them, and I can put them back in my R&D lab and get that on them.
That's where I'm headed. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question.
Do these have to be for-profit entities?
I don't know.
Does anyone know?
I think the answer is no. They can be either, because the credits can be applied. Now, some credits can only be applied against income tax. But, so there's a part of the technology jobs tax credit that can only be applied against income tax. But there's a portion of it that will go against anything you have on your CRS-1, which nonprofit entities have CRS-1 stuff as well. So I don't think there's any prohibition that I'm aware of, even in the regs, that would say something like the technology jobs tax credit or the high wage job tax credit, which is that one, that's just a check that you get, isn't it? Just like JTIP.
Well, no. The high wage job tax credit is against the CRS-1. However, it's the only credit that if your tax liability is less than your credit, they will reimburse you the difference. None of the others do that but that one. And so for that reason, if I've got multiple credits that I can take, I always want to take my high wage one last.
And the reason I'm saying that is somebody who, for example, maybe a nonprofit testing company, they test solar panels, they do something along the line of approval. I think they can qualify for the high wage job tax credit. I don't think there's anything that disqualifies that, and I'm pretty sure they can do the technology jobs tax credit as well. But one thing that I wanted you said it was a lot of money, and
I said the high wage,
yeah, the
it
high
can
wage,
be.
It can be. So just as an example, just so you guys are aware of some of the dollars, if you had, let's say, 70 employees, 80,000 was kind of the average salary, software developer type. I've seen credits in $200,000 to $250,000 annually on this high wage job tax credit.
And that's annually. That's not the whole
annual.
4 years.
No, that's annual. So these are substantial sums of money that can be used to reinvest back into the companies.
I know people are leaving mine in people.
Yes, and if you have anybody that is getting reimbursed under federal contracts, primarily with the DoD, there's certain ways to treat these credits so the federal government shares appropriately. I'll just use that term, shares appropriately, because there's some that are treating them wrong.
So straight up and down service, nonprofit organization that pays their executive director $90,000 a year would qualify for the high, or could qualify for the high wage.
I don't know.
I'm not sure that one.
I don't know.
Yeah, that one I'm not sure would qualify. It's a certain type of job they're trying to incentivize.
Would that have to be a new job?
Yeah,
Yes.
new job. In fact, JTIP is reimbursed against an employee. And in fact, I didn't mention, to get the reimbursement on JTIP for an employee, that employee has to have lived in the state of New Mexico a year in their lifetime. Okay, so if I recruit somebody from New Jersey, they've never lived in New Mexico, I'm not getting JTIP on them. Now I might get high wage on them, but I won't get JTIP. Okay, but yeah, go ahead.
If you were born in New Mexico, lived here for a year, and
That works.
Okay.
You're good to go. And the whole reason that they made it a year anytime in your lifetime was actually to get people to come back. That was the thinking. You had a question?
Oh, I'm working with a nonprofit that might be developing a jewelry manufacturing thing for their purpose, their cause, and making money. So that was good that you brought up the nonprofit because I wanted to see what advantages they could get from that.
Yeah, I would think they would qualify.
Okay, great.
Yes, sir.
How do you describe a new job? Like, is it just a firm takes their manufacturing, employees from 4 to 8? Or, I mean, how do you describe a new job? Does it have to be a new title for the company? Is it just...
It's different from JTIP to high wage, okay? So JTIP, you're getting reimbursed against an employee, a person, right? High wage, it's a job position, okay? And so the reason that's really relevant is because you're tracking a job position for a 4-year time frame. And you can have turnover in the job position over the 4-year time frame, and as long as the position does not sit vacant for more than 4 weeks in any 52-week year of the 4 years, you'll get the credit for that year. So basically, if you have turnover, you got to backfill the job within 4 weeks. Okay? So when you track, if you look at the spreadsheet that Tax and Rev created for the high wage job tax credit, you actually, as the employer, you assign whatever kind of a alphanumeric or whatever you want to track the position. And then you may have multiple people in that position over the 4-year time frame.
If you say hired in one part of your company, a new position, but you closed some operations and laid off some people in another part, is it the net job creation, or is it as long as that new position is still there? I mean, why not allocate old jobs to new jobs?
That's what I was wondering.
Well, so JTIP has a provision that deals with layoffs, okay? And so for a business to be JTIP eligible, you have to make a calculation and go back the last 8 quarters of their state unemployment tax reports and compute the average full-time equivalent head count for the last 8 quarters. And the current head count has to be equal to or greater than that 8-quarter average. Okay, so say a company's had a layoff. They've laid off 20% of the workforce. They're probably not going to be eligible for the next 2 years. But as time goes out, and that average is a moving average as you continue to go, they will probably become eligible again if they don't have another layoff. So the state does not want to reimburse companies for laying people off.
That makes sense. Hallelujah, government makes sense.
Robert?
Does high wage work with all C-level execs, CIO, CTO, CFO?
It does.
All of it?
It does.
For 4 years?
It does.
Okay.
So could a promotion qualify?
No. Okay, I better pick it up. Industrial revenue bonds. I'm going to try and make that short. I could talk all day on just this. It's the most misunderstood statutory incentive that there is. Okay. An industrial revenue bond, and there's different flavors. Okay. But in its most simple form, what I call the plain vanilla version, is essentially a property tax abatement tool. Okay? So the way it works is IRBs can relate to land, building, or equipment. All right, those are the three assets that an IRB can apply to. If you have land and building, you pay real property taxes on those. If you have equipment, you pay personal property taxes on those. And an IRB can give a business a property tax abatement on those assets. Okay? Now, you can do an IRB with the city or the county. It doesn't really matter where you're physically located in your city or in your county. You can use either one. The city and county will have different percentages of abatement. They will have different bond duration timeframes. So like I worked with a client just here a couple months ago. We did one with the county. They got an 80% property tax abatement for 20 years. Okay. I did an IRB for my company, General Technology, 15 years ago. We bought 7 acres of land, built a 70,000 square foot building, and we had 100% property tax abatement for 20 years. Okay, so people will ask, why does the city or county government, why would they want to do these? What's in it for them? Okay, so they will do a fiscal impact analysis of the project. And they will basically weigh, okay, we're giving up these property taxes. What are we getting in return? Well, what they're getting in return is job creation. So you're creating jobs. Those new jobs create more payroll taxes, more income taxes, more people buy houses, all those good things, right? And so the one I just did 2 months ago was a company that the jobs were pretty high paying. They weren't going to be creating an enormous number, but the number they were creating were really good paying jobs. And so, same thing, you know, when I did mine 15 years ago. So you have to make a commitment of how many jobs do you expect to create in like a 3-year window. The return on, they did 2 calculations on the one I did 2 months ago. They did a payback period and they did a return on investment calculation. And the payback period was like 30 months, and the ROI was like 38%. So it was a no-brainer from the county's point of view. So that's why they would do it. Now, the kind I did 15 years ago was not the plain vanilla. Mine was the small manufacturers tax-exempt industrial revenue bond. Okay, so for manufacturing companies, there's another type that can be done. I did mine for $4.1 million to buy my 7 acres and build my 70,000 foot building. I committed to 36 new jobs in a 3-year window. We hit the 36 jobs in 18 months. And then what it did for me and my company in terms of property tax abatement, the county assessor came in one day. I took him through the building. We go back to my office. He says, well, I know you have 100% property tax abatement, but in case you're curious as to what you would have been paying if you didn't, it was $75,000 a year. And that was in 1999. So even if the taxes never went up, which is probably not going to be the case, that saved me $1.5 million over 20 years.
So you don't pay taxes forever?
No, just the period of the IRB.
Okay.
And do you have to maintain the jobs for the 20-year window as well?
No.
So once you create the jobs, if the jobs end up going away, there's no clawback from the county?
IRBs do have clawbacks today. They didn't used to in the past, but they do today. So for example, when SHOP closed out of Mesa del Sol, they paid a $5 million clawback to the city of Albuquerque. Yep. Yeah.
Can you sell them?
I don't know.
And if you can, I was wondering what you have to do in order to maintain it. Do you have to produce the jobs over the first 36 months and then it's fully locked in? I don't know if you don't know.
I don't know if you can sell them. Now, you being a banker, let me just kind of tell you how a bank can come into play on this. So on the one that I did 15 years ago, that type, my bond for $4.1 million went out into the marketplace and was sold. Okay, so some investor bought my bond. And the type of bond I had was the type, when I said it was the small manufacturers tax exempt industrial revenue bond, that tax exempt part of the adjective there relates to whoever buys the bond, the interest that I'm paying them, they don't have to pay income tax on it. So since they don't have to pay income tax on that income stream, they're willing to accept a lower interest rate than what they would otherwise expect to get. So when I closed on my bonds April the 1st of '99, and I could have chosen a fixed rate or a variable rate. I chose a variable rate tied to 7-day treasuries. My rate the day I closed was 3.3%. Had I gotten a conventional mortgage, it would have been like 7 3/4 at that time. And then it floated every week. It readjusted every week over the next 5 years that I was still the CFO there. It went as high as 4.1 and went as low as 1.1. But to get someone to buy my bond, General Technology Corporation in Albuquerque, knew what? I had to get a bank to issue a letter of credit to credit enhance my bond, so that if I defaulted, the bank would step up and make the investor whole. And so I have to pay the bank for that letter of credit, and I couldn't have sold my bond without that. No one would have bought it. I'm not Intel, I'm not General Mills that has their own credit ratings. So for that kind of bond, you absolutely have to have a bank to issue a letter of credit.
So how is that, is it rated a certain?
The bond rating is going to be, in that case, the rating of the bank.
Oh.
So my company doesn't have a rating, but the bank issuing a letter of credit, they have a rating. And that's why I want a bank with the highest rating that I can get.
Dennis, before your time is up and our time is up, could you tell us how we can help you, e.g. how do we identify, target, introduce you to prospective beneficiaries of this program?
You know, any business that's economic based is really the target. That's the sweet spot. So if over half their revenues are to out-of-state customers, love to talk to them. Okay. It doesn't matter what size the business is.
How should we do that? Should we just try to set up a one-on-one meeting with you or another one of the people at AED? How do you want us to do that?
I'd be the point of contact.
Okay.
And if you want to be at the meeting, great.
That's how most trusted advisors like to do it.
And if you don't want to be at the meeting, that's okay too.
Okay.
You know, a lot of people will say, gosh, I'd love to know what a meeting looks like.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dennis, you and Bob Walton both do this. You do this every week. When you meet with businesses and talk about all these possibles.
Right. Yeah, we visited 1,400 companies to date.
Wow.
I've been doing it 9 years. Bob's been doing it 12. He started the program at AED. We keep adding to that 1,400 at a pace of about 140 a year. Okay, so I work 2 days a week at AED. Bob works 3 days a week at AED. Between the two of us, we're one FTE. And we're still meeting 140 companies a year. So no one else does it. There is no one else that does this. Prior to AED taking this on, the Chamber of Commerce, the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce, would go out and visit companies, and they would basically take a survey. And then, you know, the survey information might be shared with the company, but there was nobody really working with local existing companies, addressing their needs and what was their primary issues impeding them from growing. And so we're the first to do that. And quite honestly, even around the country, if you look at other cities and other states that have people that are out visiting local existing companies, they're taking surveys. They're really not doing anything the way we do it.
So it sounds like this is a subset of what you're doing when you're meeting with these businesses as well. There's more
It is.
to it than
It is.
just
It is.
these incentives.
Yeah.
So what,
Well, and that's the next section.
sorry.
No, that's good. So let's just go through the rest of these real quick on the incentives. So gross receipts tax exemption for manufacturers was passed in the 2012 legislature. That has to do with, if I'm a manufacturer, historically, any of the raw material components that I buy that go into my manufacturing process that result in some type of a finished good, I don't have to pay gross receipts tax on those. I issue an NTTC, a non-taxable transaction certificate, and I don't pay gross receipts on those. However, consumable supplies that I use as a manufacturer, I've always had to pay gross receipts tax. No longer. Okay? Utilities are a consumable supply for a manufacturing company. So those can be pretty large expenditures that they no longer have to pay gross receipts tax on. So it's phased in. I'm not going to go through all the details, but that is huge. And in fact, this company that I recruited here from California, Flagship, the food manufacturer, that caught their attention. In that 45 minutes that I spent with them one morning, and I went through everything really fast, that right there caught their attention more than anything else. One of the three guys looked at the other guy and said, "Are we paying sales tax in California on our utility bills?" "Yeah, we are." Maybe we want to be in New Mexico. Okay. Single sales factor, that has to do with manufacturers who are predominantly exporting what they make to customers outside the state. They now can use a single sales factor for the calculation of their taxes, and the throwback rule has been eliminated, where used to be any sales to another state that they didn't have a nexus in got thrown back to New Mexico. That's been done away with. So the end result of number 7 there is that manufacturers in New Mexico who export a very large percentage of their sales outside of the state can now reduce their state of New Mexico corporate income tax dramatically. Okay. Alternative energy product manufacturers tax credit, that's for companies that are in the alternative energy industry, and it's like a second credit on their manufacturing equipment. So there's the standard one, and then there's this second one for being in that industry. Rural jobs tax credit, I don't really know much about that since I'm not working rural. Cost segregation studies. When I built my building 15 years ago, I did a cost segregation study on the building. What is that? It's a study to basically categorize the expenditures that I'm paying my general contractor between brick and mortar category with long-term depreciation versus the part of the contract that's going to be a faster depreciation schedule. And because I did an IRB on the building, I don't have to pay gross receipts tax on the part of the general contractor's invoice that relates to the faster depreciated part of the construction. It's my cost segregation study cost, this was 15 years ago, I think I paid $10,000 to have it done, and it saved me like $75,000 in gross receipts tax. So I mean, it was like, yeah. There's a child care credit. If a company reimburses employees as a benefit, employee benefit, for a percentage of their child care costs, they can get a 30% credit on what they're reimbursing the employee. There's an out-of-state tuition waiver for people that move here, so that the first year that they go to college, if they go to either UNM or CNM, they can pay in-state tuition rate that first year rather than having to wait for 1 year to establish residency to pay the lower in-state tuition. That's because of the lottery scholarship. And then companies that want to get ISO 9000 certified can do that through the state at a very subsidized less expensive rate than what it would cost normally. Okay, so we've already gone over 5 minutes. You want to hang in a little longer, everybody? Okay. So item D here is kind of, this is the way it looks when I go visit a company. And so it all starts with the first visit. So typically I'm going to meet with the business owner or a high-level person running that business, general manager, what have you. And that first visit is going to be an hour. And I may go back to the same company, who knows how many times, but that first visit I always do a better job than I'm doing today keeping it at an hour, okay? And in that hour, I try to understand the business. What do you do? Who do you do it for? Who are your customers? And then I ask the question, what's the number one constraint keeping your business from growing? And so after 1,400 companies that Bob and I have done, we've heard a lot of answers to that question. But it doesn't matter what the answer is. Whatever it is, then we go to work to try to reduce or mitigate or eliminate that constraint. And as we have success in doing that, that business starts to grow. They start to hire people, they expand. And so that's kind of the simplistic description of what we do. A lot of people will say, well, do I have to pay you to help me? Absolutely not. They say, well, do I have to be a member of AED? Because they know that we're a nonprofit and our funding to be able to help companies is because companies join AED and pay annual membership to be a member of AED. And so the answer to that is no. You don't have to be a member of AED for us to help you. You don't have to pay us. You don't have to do anything. And if you want to eventually join AED and kind of, give back, great. But there's no obligation. So that's kind of how that works. Then what's in our toolbox to help them, in addition to these statutory incentives, really fall into a couple of areas. We have about 35 strategic partners that we work with, that we know very well, that are various resources that are out there that a lot of businesses are not aware of, that we can introduce to that business to assist them. And the vast majority of those strategic partners cost the business nothing either, okay? But people just don't know about them. So a lot of times what we can do to help a business is just introduce one of our strategic partners to the business. The first strategic partner that we got when Bob started doing this 12 years ago was the ELCDC. The ELCDC helps businesses get SBA loans. That's what they do, okay? So they're kind of sort of like a loan intermediary, so to speak. And a company that Bob met with needed to get a loan. An SBA loan was the appropriate loan for this particular type of business. And so he learned about the ELCDC, and so that's one of our strategic partners. That's just one example. So we've got like 35 of these resources that are out there that can really help businesses, but a lot of people just don't know about it. Another tool in our toolbox is what we call business to business. So now that we've learned and really gotten to know quite well 1,400 companies in town, we really know a lot of capabilities that are out there. And so anytime we see an opportunity to make an introduction of this local business to this local business to where they can do business between themselves, and that replaces this business from buying whatever from an out-of-state supplier, that's good. To bring more business local than having things purchased and money going out of state. So we do a lot of that. Business financing. So back in the financial meltdown of 08 and 09, lots of companies were in a crisis mode. Their banks were calling them and calling their loans, and they didn't know where to go. They didn't know what to do. And a lot of those people called AED. And they said, can you help me? So all those calls went to me back at that time. And it was tough because quite honestly, if there's give or take, call it 20 banks in town, at that time maybe 2 of the 20 were making new loans. It was bad. So did we help them? Yeah, we helped them. At that time, we didn't help them by finding a new bank home that was a traditional commercial bank because they weren't making new loans. But we did find a lot of alternative lenders that we could get them with to take out the old bank and have a new lending relationship with. Things are way better now. Way better now. Are all 20 banks, if there's still 20, making new loans? Probably not. But I'd say 90% of them are. So it's much better now, even though the lending criteria today is way different than pre-recession. But it is what it is. We do the best we can. And so when a business needs a loan, I can very efficiently evaluate the business, what they need the loan for, their current financial situation, and to start with, are they even bankable, period. And I can figure that out in about 15 minutes. So I can save them a lot of time if they're not bankable to say, you're not at a place right now to even go talk to banks. You need to be talking to these people or these people or these people in the alternative lending space that is really more appropriate for you. Or if they are bankable, which of the banks, are they the best fit with? I mean, every bank has certain appetites for certain industries or lack of appetite for certain industries. I mean, right now, you could kind of say that the industry that's on the outs is construction. Banks, even banks that used to really like construction, right now don't maybe like construction so much. So that's a challenge. But if you happen to be in an industry that I know that bank does not like your industry, then why would you even go talk to them? So I can help in that way. Okay, Gage.
One thing that because we've had Dennis on the radio show, and we've also had Bob Walton on, so we've had a chance to talk quite a bit. One of the neat things about what Dennis and Bob do is they network. When they talk about 140 businesses, they're networking with 140 businesses. They get the opportunity, because one of the questions is, we asked them, what do you need? You told one of the stories of you put a supplier together with a manufacturer. I remember that story. I mean, that's the kind of power that happens.
Exactly.
When you get a new collaborator.
Yeah. And the more companies we know, the better we're at doing that. Yeah. Okay, so call to action. What can you all do? Back to your question, David. What can you do to help create jobs in New Mexico? Educate yourselves. Communicate your desires to your elected officials. I think a lot of people sometimes have strong ideas, strong opinions, but maybe they're hesitant to pick up the phone, or they're hesitant to try to go meet face to face with an elected official that wants to hear what you have to say. One of the fabulous things about New Mexico and our elected officials, and I've lived here 50 years, so I've known a few elected officials. I think our elected officials are so approachable. And that's not the case in every state. I mean, there's a lot of states where there's so many gatekeepers you can't even add them all up to get in front of someone. It's not like that here. Our elected officials are very, very approachable. And so whether you're talking at the state level or Congress or whatever, don't be bashful. Okay? Join organizations that are working to make a difference. Join AED. And we're not the only ones, but certainly think about that. If your organization is not a member of AED, consider that. Run for elected office yourself. sometimes if I talk to a group of people and someone in the group is just a real griper, complainer, and you just can't seem to get them to turn it off, and that's okay, you know, that's okay. A lot of times I'll say, well, why don't you run for office and make a difference? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. But I'm serious. I'm not saying it facetiously or trying to be funny. I'm serious. You can make a difference. One person can make a difference. So consider that. Get engaged. Be a part of the solution. Be the 20% that make a difference, not the 80% that complain and criticize. Help New Mexico become a right-to-work state. Right now, if I could say, what's the one thing that could help us more than any other single thing, it would be passage of right to work. Now, historically, that's only come out of the legislature once ever. Okay? And that was a long time ago. It was over 30 years ago. The House and the Senate passed right to work, and the governor at the time vetoed it. So the challenge today is getting it through the legislature. Governor Martinez, for the last 4 years, has said if I ever had a right to work bill in front of me, I would sign it. But it's getting it through the legislature.
Do you have a little succinct definition of what that right to work bill means for the state of New Mexico?
You know, I don't know how well I can really do that, but here's what I can tell you. There's 24 states that are right to work. And if you were to do a search and just do some online research and look at the 26 states that we're one of that are not, and the 24 states that are, and look at the job creation in the last 10 years, it is just cut and dry. The right-to-work states are creating jobs at a rate of 3 times the non-right-to-work states.
Is that also referred to as little baking days?
Well, that was legislation that affects some of the same thing. Yeah. But right to work is basically saying if a state passes right to work, then you cannot be forced for a particular job to join a union. Because that's how it is. If you're not a right-to-work state, there are certain companies where to have a job there, you have to be in the union. So our surrounding states are predominantly right-to-work, and they're killing us. Just killing us. When site selection consultants are doing a down select, so they're hired by a client to help that client site select a location to put a new facility. So they have a checklist, okay, and everyone probably has a little different checklist, but they have their first cut at it, of cutting it from 50 states down to whatever. And 90% of the site selection consultants will have, is it a right to work state on the initial checklist. And if you're not, you're not even in the game. You're not even in the race. So whatever influence anyone here has towards that, you can make a difference that way.
Dennis?
Uh-huh.
What's the ratio of employees in New Mexico that are right to work, that are union versus non-union?
Don't know. I really don't know.
It's pretty small, though, isn't
Well,
it?
I would agree. That's my perception that that the unionization in New Mexico is not as high as it would be in the Rust Belt. Okay. However, we have a lot of teachers that are union in New Mexico. So I'm not sure how that plays into it.
I don't even think that would affect public jobs, would it? that would be separate under the right to work legislation that's been proposed.
Yeah, it would, exactly right.
And they can still stay in the union, they just don't have to pay union dues anymore, once it becomes a right to work state.
That's
So
right.
That's why they fight it all the time, right?
Unions don't like it because it weakens their ability to mandate, if you want this job, you gotta join our union. Okay, I think we're done.
Eh,
Thank you.